The Americans almost had the world's first assault rifle in an intermediate cartridge, 10 years before the Germans would come up with it in the Second World War. But one man prevented this from happening with a decision that directly led to the M1 Garand as we know it today. Now, this is going to be a bit of a different documentary than you're used to, because I'm going to show you the other side of this infamous rifle. When World War I started, every major army on Earth had bolt-action rifles in powerful cartridges as the main armament for their infantry. They were making them absurdly long so that when the bayonet was mounted, it would outrange the enemy's rifle once the battle got in close. So you see how modern their approach was when they treated their rifles more like spears than firearms. It's pretty weird if you think about it. They had the power and precision to hit targets 1,000 meters away, but then at the same time they only held 5 rounds and were half treated like spears. But anyway, that's how it was, and as you probably already know, it fell apart pretty quickly once the war began and slid into a deadlock of trenches where a sharpened shovel was more effective than these rifles. Around this time, the Americans had a bit of a problem. Their official standard rifle was the Springfield M1903 in the 30-06 full-power cartridge, but they only had about 600,000 of them when they entered the war and couldn't make them fast enough. So they took the British pattern 1914 design, rechambered it for 30-06, called it the M1917, and mass-produced it. By the time the war ended, around 3/4 of the Americans fighting in France were actually carrying the M1917, not the M1903. With the war over and lessons learned, some countries began looking for something more effective than the bolt-action rifle. Although actually Mexico had already pulled this off years before World War I even started, with their Mondragon rifle produced by SIG, which was adopted by the Mexican army in 1908, making it the first country in the world to issue a semi-automatic service rifle. And don't get me wrong, most countries were working on what they called self-loading rifles at the time, but no one could really make them work reliably and keep them cost-effective for production in the hundreds of thousands. There was even a Danish guy named Søren Bang who came to Springfield Armory back in 1911 with a semi-auto rifle that captured propellant gas at the muzzle to cycle the action. It was clever but too delicate to be adopted, but the basic principle would directly inspire the gas-operated system, which would later lead to some new designs you're about to see. And one of the countries attempting all this was, of course, the United States. They started in 1921, putting out a request for the Army's next infantry rifle to be semi-automatic, weigh no more than the M1903, be reliable, and fire their beloved 30-06. It was quite a challenge for the time, and it would take 15 years to be solved. But a guy named John Cantius Garand, through some ups and downs and competing against other designers like John Pedersen, actually came up with something that might have been even better than what the US Army wanted. This guy Pedersen argued that the 30-06 was simply more powerful than what was needed, especially given what World War I had proven. And he wanted to come up with a less powerful cartridge which would make designing the rifle around it much easier, but it would still be more than deadly on the battlefield at the ranges where the fighting was happening. That would later become known as an intermediate cartridge. He created the 276 Pedersen, which was a 7x50 1mm rimless round that had about half the recoil energy of the 30-06. There were worries that the round might not be powerful enough, so they did the next logical thing and arranged ballistic tests, where instead of ballistic gel, they used anesthetized pigs that was shot at various ranges with 3 calibers, the 256, the 276, and the 30 caliber. Then they examined the wounds, and what they found actually went against the 30-06. All 3 rounds killed at long range, but at a typical combat distance of around 300 yards, the smallest caliber actually inflicted the most severe wounds, and the 276 was right there with it. So the smaller rounds were arguably more deadly at the ranges where real fighting happens. They also built the Pedersen rifle in this new caliber, fed from a 10-round on-block clip, which was put into the receiver and then ejected after the last shot. Sounds familiar, right? They had the working prototype of this Pedersen rifle, and it worked well in testing. It even looked like it might replace the M1903 and the Browning automatic rifle. So Garand, who had his new gas-operated rifle, was ordered to abandon his 30-06 work and to make it in this new 276 cartridge, which then went on competing with the Pedersen rifle among a few others, and Garand's and Pedersen's designs were ahead of everyone else's. So both were ordered to continue their work and refinement. In the next trial, the Garand performed better than the Pedersen and had a few very important advantages. Garand's rifle had 60 parts, while Pedersen's had 99, and the Pedersen also had to use wax-coated ammo to work properly, which would be a nightmare for logistics in war. So Garand's T3E2 prototype in .276 caliber was recommended for adoption, and it almost got adopted. Almost. If they had adopted this rifle in this caliber, America would have been the first country in the world to use the intermediate cartridge, which had a bunch of advantages over the full-power ones like the .30-06. And that's why assault rifles today are in such calibers. The round was still more than effective, but much lighter, so the rifle itself could be lighter too. With bigger ammo capacity, soldiers could carry more rounds for the same weight, and firing was more controllable, which is important for the fully automatic options. But there was one thing standing in the way. The United States had a bunch of .30-06 stockpiles from the First World War, and they couldn't just let them sit there. They had to burn through them first before bothering with the new caliber and the whole transitioning process with the weapons and logistics to match it, and all of this while the Great Depression was at its height. So the Army Chief of Staff, General Douglas MacArthur, said that there was no way they were going to be making a new caliber rifle now, and ordered the work on it to cease immediately and completely. It was a logical decision given the situation, but you and I are left to wonder what the fighting in World War II would have looked like if the Americans had this intermediate cartridge rifle before anyone else. But here's the thing, Garand never actually fully abandoned the .30-06. He kept a parallel .30-06 development just in case, and he already had a working prototype called the T1E2 sitting ready. So when MacArthur killed the .276, Garand didn't have to scramble and rebuild everything. He just pivoted to the rifle he already had, and in 1933 that T1E2 was officially redesignated Semi-Automatic Rifle Caliber 30 M1. Gas-operated semi-automatic rifle in this .30-06 they wanted so badly, weighing about 9.5 pounds empty. Long, wood and steel, a strong, solid rifle. Of course, you already know how it loads. That thing, called an on-block clip, holds 8 rounds, drops into the receiver, and ejects with that satisfying ping when the last round is fired. A skilled shooter can reload the whole thing in as little as 2 seconds, which was quite the jump from the 5-round stripper clips of the bolt-action rifles of the time, still in use by almost all armies. A trained rifleman can put out 30 to 50 aimed shots per minute against the 8 to 15 with a bolt action. You have that famous test of the M1 against the M1903 firing side by side, so you can see in real time how much more firepower a soldier now has. Through further refinement, the rifle was adopted as the standard infantry weapon, but its real problems were just about to start. The first production M1 started showing a strange defect that became known as the 7th round stoppage. After firing 6 of the 8 rounds the rifle held in the clip, the 7th round would jam, and at first nobody could figure out why. It turned out to be a production problem where part of the receiver was carved too deep, which caused the clip with just 2 rounds left to tilt and misfeed. Then there was the muzzle problem, with the original gas trap which had a cap fitted over the end of the barrel that captured propellant gas after the bullet had left, and forced it back to drive the operating rod. This was that principle from the Bang rifle I mentioned earlier, which had the very same problem with fouling. By March 1940, a much simpler design was made, basically a hole drilled through the underside of the barrel a few inches behind the muzzle, which then channeled gas down into a cylinder under the barrel and onto the long-stroke piston. And all the older Garands were recalled and rebuilt, correcting these issues. So production was now being ramped up when it became clear that the war was about to happen, and by the end of 1941, the army was fully equipped with the new rifle. You know, on paper. The Marines were a bit of a complicated case when it came to the Garand. The popular story is that they didn't trust the new design and they didn't want to give up the old reliable Springfields, which is true, but only partly. The Marines had been interested in semi-autos for quite some time, but those early Garands had the problems I mentioned, and they knew this wasn't going to work with their amphibious operations, where the rifles would be dragged through sand and salt water. So they were cautiously getting equipped with the M1s, and even when Pearl Harbor happened, Marine units were mostly armed with M1903s. So the Garand's actual first taste of combat was with the Army, in the doomed defense of Bataan in late 1941 and early 1942, where American and Filipino troops held out for 3 months against the Japanese before surrendering in April. From that fight, MacArthur, the same MacArthur who killed the .276 cartridge a decade earlier, sent a report back praising the rifle, saying it worked even after a week of constant action without cleaning. Then later, when the Marines landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, still carrying their M1903s, the Army's 164th Infantry Regiment arrived in October as reinforcements, bringing M1s with them. And Marines being Marines, they did some, quote, moonlight requisitioning, which basically meant stealing them whenever they could. They even traded for them, because they had stacks of captured Japanese souvenirs like flags and swords, okay, maybe skulls or some other things, which the Army boys had badly wanted, so there was an exchange of rifles here and there. Either way, it turned out pretty quickly that the M1 was a huge improvement over the bolt action. Now, the Garand thumb is one of those military folk stories, but unlike most of them, which turn out to be nothing more than a lousy myth, this one was quite true. When you load the M1, you pull the bolt all the way back and lock it open. Then you press the loaded clip down into the opened receiver with your thumb, and the moment the clip seats, a follower drops and the bolt slams forward under heavy spring pressure, and chambers the first round. But the problem was when the bolt wasn't fully locked back, or you pressed straight down with the flat of your thumb instead of with the side, that spring-loaded bolt would slam shut with your thumb in its path, giving you that well-known Garand thumb, a deep bruise of pinched flesh and a blackened thumbnail that took a few weeks to grow back. And you might think, oh yeah, well, they're stupid. How could they let something like that happen? Well, try doing that flawlessly in the middle of combat while bullets are cracking past your ears, and at that moment, think about the right technique for loading a clip. However, while the Garand thumb wasn't a myth, there was a ping myth. That high-pitched ping after the empty clip is ejected was said to reveal your position to the enemy and let them know that you're now out of ammo, so they could rush you. But this actually happening in real life was much harder than it sounds. After all, you'd need to hear the ping over the gunfire and explosions during an active firefight while your ears are ringing. You'd have to be close enough to actually do something, because a soldier reloading wouldn't exactly do it standing straight up in the middle of the battlefield. And he wasn't alone most of the time anyway, so when you heard that ping and jumped out to shoot the soldier with his rifle empty, there were his buddies around him who quickly stood up and fired while he was reloading. So if this ping was a real problem in battle, it had to be in very specific conditions to actually mean something. The real problem with the on-block clip in combat was actually reloading the rifle when it was half full, or half empty if you're a pessimist. If you fire all 8 rounds, the clip flies out. You put a full one in and continue with your day. But when you fire 3 or 4 rounds, then run and take cover, and now let's say you want to rush an enemy position and you like a full clip in your rifle, well, here's the problem. You can pull the bolt back to lock it open and press a little latch that ejects your clip with the rounds you have left. Then you can pick them up from the dirt and put them in your pocket if you want, or, in the more realistic scenario, throw them away and put a fresh clip in. But if you really wanted to top up your rifle, the process is weird and needs both hands. You had to lock the bolt back, press the clip latch, but only just enough to let the clip come halfway out of the receiver, then ease the bolt forward gently so it pins the clip in place. Then, with the clip stuck there halfway and held out by the bolt, you push the new rounds one by one on top of the ones already in there. Pretty straightforward, right? You wouldn't be doing that in any form of combat, of course, so the usual method was just firing the rest of your rounds and putting in the new clip before you continue with your plans for the day. Now, in Europe, fighting the Germans, the M1 was a clear advantage over the German Kar-98, which was pretty much the same World War I-era rifle design, and was the most numerous German weapon of the war. The Germans had much better machine guns, sure, but their squad was still mostly armed with bolt actions, so if their only source of firepower got knocked out, they were now clearly the underdogs in a firefight with the American squad. They had the STG-44, but it was built in numbers too low to make a real difference, while the Kar-98 was produced in over 14 million. The Germans had actually been working on their own semi-auto rifle, but the program was a mess because of a strange order that no holes would be drilled into rifle barrels for gas operation. Unlike the American engineers who solved the problem with one little hole drilled near the end of the barrel, the Germans were afraid that this would weaken it, and they even feared the semi-auto system failing, so they wanted a manual bolt-action backup. So the result was just a couple of weird versions of the Gewehr 41, which turned out too expensive and unreliable, and they ended up being built in numbers way too low to make any difference. But the Germans then captured Soviet SVT-40 rifles on the Eastern Front, and discovered that the Soviets used that barrel gas port system the German High Command had so strictly forbidden, and it worked just fine, just like the Garand, without blowing the rifle up. So they put that idea into the Gewehr 43 with a detachable 10-round magazine, and this rifle worked quite well, although still in small numbers and mostly used as a semi-automatic sniper rifle. Japan had it even worse. They spent years working on various semi-auto projects and just gave up, committing fully to the good old bolt-action Arisaka rifles for the entire war. They even barely had any submachine guns. They made the Type 100, but in numbers way too low to make any real difference again. However, as the M1 Garand created a gap in firepower between the American and Japanese squads that was impossible to ignore, the Imperial Japanese Navy, which had more independent weapons development, tried to copy the captured Garand. They tried to chamber it for the Japanese 7.7mm Arisaka cartridge, and the rifle actually worked. Just the on-block clip wouldn't work with it. So they replaced it with a fixed 10-round internal magazine fed by two 5-round Arisaka stripper clips and called the thing the Type 4. When Japan surrendered, they had about 100 of these rifles, but none of them ever saw combat. After World War II, Garand production stopped, but the rifle stayed in active duty. And then in 1950, the Korean War began and the good old M1 went into combat again under some of the worst field conditions. The sniper variants M1C and M1D finally saw real combat there. The fighting was still pretty much World War II style, but it was already clear that something better could be put in service. Something like the German STG-44 with an intermediate cartridge, a full auto option, and much higher ammo capacity. So the US went looking for something to replace the M1, and the process eventually led to the M14, chambered in that new 7.62 by 51mm NATO round, and supposed to be a new modern rifle with the features I just mentioned. Only, it turned out not to be remotely close to the solution, since the caliber was still pretty similar to the 30-06, and not an intermediate cartridge. So the M14 ended up being an expensive program that created a rifle not much different conceptually from the M1, and went on to have the shortest service of any rifle in the modern American military. But it replaced the Garand anyway as a stopgap until the real solution was developed, which would be the M16, now finally in that intermediate cartridge Pedersen had argued for all those years before the M1 even existed. So there you go, a pretty expensive I told you so when it comes to the caliber choice, but it is what it is.